Okay, welcome everyone tonight. This is the last year that we will be giving before Tisha B'Av comes, and then Be'ezrat Hashem, if everything goes as planned, hopefully we will be able to be graced with the Torah from Rav Meish Targin on Tisha B'Av. So tonight's shir called "Why Does Hashem Listen to the Cries of Rahel Imeinu?" So these psukim, I'm actually just going to scroll down. I remember as a child, I was in the choir in America. I grew up in America, and I was in a school called Moriah. And we used to sing this song, Kol Berama. I'm not going to sing it because I don't have a good voice. We used to sing that song in choir, and I remember as a child, I loved that song. And I continued even as an adult to sing that song sometimes to my children, and I always found it very touching. And as a child, I didn't really understand or really know what it was about, but there was something about the tune and maybe possibly the words that was just very touching. And I think that these psukim are some of the most powerful psukim, I think, that we can find in Tanakh, the most stirring, that they really pull on our heartstrings. When we read these psukim, they really touch a chord. And so these before we open the Sha'arei Dima tonight, the gates of tears, the gate that was actually never closed even after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, I want to look into the story, the famous story, without going into it in too much detail, but just bigadol, to look at the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, what the sages say was what brought about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and think about how this story is connected with the pasuk that we just spoke about Kol Berama Nishma, that the voice of Rachel Imeinu is heard and her cries are heard. And we're going to look into those psukim even more to understand better. So in the story, we're going to look at it just outside, and in the English, you see the Gemara in Gittin explains that Yerushalayim was destroyed because of this story. And this is a story I think that we grow up on, we hear about it, and it's always important, I think, to revisit the story, even once a year to revisit it, because we can kind of look at it with new lenses and see it from different angles every time we approach it. So we can't leave it in that box of the story that I grew up on as a child, but rather we need to develop, the story needs to evolve the way that we're evolving, needs to evolve with us so that we can understand it on a new level. So they bring in this story and they explain that there was this man, and this man doesn't have a name. They call him Gavra, okay? Dahu Gavra. So we don't know his name, but we do know the names of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? So there was a man whose friend, he had a friend called Kamsa, and he had an enemy called Bar Kamsa. Okay, so already we're starting off in this hostile sort of environment where there's friends and there's enemies. There's two sides of the line. Okay, and so this Gavra, this man who is nameless, and maybe on purpose, this man is nameless because maybe this story is coming to represent something that's bigger than just this particular Gavra, right? And so he's making this large feast, and he says to his servant, please go and invite my friend called Kamsa. Now here we see that there's this confusion of identities, a confusion of names, and we can understand that in the Jewish world, that people can get confused between Silbermann and Silbermann, for example, or I don't know, different names that can sound very similar, and people can get confused and possibly send the invitation to the wrong home, right? So he goes to the wrong home and he invites Bar Kamsa. Now it's interesting that his enemy Bar Kamsa actually heeds to the call of the invitation, and he shows up. He shows up at the party, and the host, we'll call him the host, who was hosting this feast, he comes and he finds Bar Kamsa sitting at his feast. So rather than, at the time of the party, right before the party, and now we're in erev bat mitzvah of our daughter, right? So before the bat mitzvah, there's lots and lots of different plans, and there's lots of pieces and things to figure out. So before the party, we can understand that it's one thing to maybe correct a mistake, but once you're at the party, there are a lot of things that will happen, possibly many things that can go wrong, and we need to let them slide. But we see here that the host didn't really learn that lesson, right? So he sees that Bar Kamsa is sitting at the table, eating his feast, enjoying the chicken, and he approaches him and he comes over to him and he says, and he calls him, he says, that man is the enemy, Baal Devava, of that man, which is really saying in different words that you are my enemy. And so what are you doing here? What do you want? Why are you here? Get up and leave. Now Bar Kamsa says to him, listen, I've already come, okay? Let me just stay. Let's keep this quiet. Let's keep it between us. Let's not cause any scene over here. I'll give you money, okay? I'll cover the cost for my meal. You don't need to worry about that, but just let me stay, okay? And the conversation goes on. At this point, we would expect the host to say, okay, you know what? Let's put our grievances aside. I want to also enjoy this feast that I'm making, okay? Maybe like we would expect him also not to want to cause a whole stir. But no, instead he says, no, you must leave. And Bar Kamsa says to him, I'll pay for half. Okay, you see here that he's so desperate to the point that he's willing to even pay for half of the feast. And Bar Kamsa and the host says, no. He says, no, you must leave. And Bar Kamsa then says to him, I'll give you money for the entire feast. And I'm assuming that this was quite of an expensive feast. And he says, no, you must leave. And finally, he takes Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and took him out physically. Okay? That's how extreme that's how deep this sin'ah, this hatred he had for Bar Kamsa, to the point where he couldn't even allow this to slide and let him just sit there eating quietly his chicken. Now, Bar Kamsa says to himself something very interesting. He doesn't make a comment on the host, but rather he says, since the sages were sitting there and they didn't protest, this is a sign. They saw this humiliation. This is a sign that they were happy, right? They're happy. They're content. They're okay. Silence as an affirmation that this is okay. What's going on? Right, as Elie Wiesel speaks about that, and my husband spoke about that, about how a bystander is part of what's actually going on. There's no such thing as being neutral in such a situation. And so basically he comes to the conclusion that since they were okay with this, what am I going to do? I'm going to inform the emperor, the Romans, about the Jews, and I'm going to concoct a story and explain that the Jews are rebelling against you. So he goes and he tells the emperor, and the emperor says, how do you know? And he says, okay, test it out. I'm telling you that they're rebelling against you. Send them an offering and just see whether they'll sacrifice it. And what does he do? Bar Kamsa goes and he makes a blemish on the part of the animal, either the lip or the eye, whichever part, and that also has symbolism, but we won't get into that. The story is not the focus of our story tonight. And according to them, this is not a blemish that they would consider to be a blemish, and it's something that they would sacrifice. But according to us, it is a blemish. Yet it's something that we can't explain in a satisfactory kind of way to the Gentiles. It's something that wouldn't be understood by them, why we cannot sacrifice it. And so therefore he causes this blemish, which is in a very smart, sly kind of way, and he sends off this korban. And from there on in the rest of the story, the rabbis have this whole discussion about whether or not they should bring this korban. And if they bring the korban, then people are going to say, and they're going to think, well, now, like, right, the rabbis say, let's bring the korban because of, we have to make sure that we have peaceful relations with the governing body in the land. And And the other side of the coin was, but then if people see that there's a blemish on the korban, then they'll start to bring korbanot with blemishes. And in the end, they decide not to bring the korban. And as the Gemara points out, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the destruction of the temple, because the Jews were seen as rebelling against the Romans. Okay. So, what is so significant about that story that we just read? I think that there are two themes that come across very strongly. We see the themes of silence and the theme of shame. Okay, so keep those themes and this story in mind as we return to the tears and the story of Rachel Imeinu. Okay, so if we look in Yirmiyahu and we look at these psukim, and I think we can't help but just look inside and read these psukim. And if anyone here has a good voice, you can sing the song as well. Ko amar Hashem. Hashem says, Kol berama nishma nihi bechi tamrurim Rachel mevaka al banea. A cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. Me'ana linachem. She refuses to be comforted for her children. Ki enenu. For her children who are gone. And so Hashem replies to her and he says, Ko amar Hashem min ikolech mi bechi. Restrain your voice from weeping. Hold your tears back. Ve'einayich midima. Your eyes from shedding tears. Ki yesh sachar lepu'latech. Because there's reward for your labor. Ne'um Hashem, as declares Hashem, V'shavu me'eretz oyev. They're going to return from the land of the enemies. Ve'yesh tikva la'achiratech. And there's hope for your future. As the Lord declares, the Lord, V'shavu vanim ligvulam. Let the children return from their country. The children will return to their borders, to their boundaries. They will return to their country. And this is a song that we often like to sing when someone makes aliyah. It's just this song it's also just a very powerful song to sing. V'shavu vanim v'shav, right? That we're returning to our boundaries, to our borders. So when we read this psukim, we ask ourselves the question of why are her cries answered? Right? There are many avot and imahot, and there are other people that are righteous tzaddikim. Why dafka are the cries of Rachel Imeinu answered? Why does she stand out amongst the other imahot? And we also see that she stands out in another place when it's referring to the place of her burial. That she also stands out from the Avot and Imahot. As we see in Breshit, in towards the end of Sefer Breshit, when Yaakov is speaking to Yosef and he's explaining about his mother, and he says to him, when I was returning from Padan, Rachel died. And he says how hard it was for him. And I while I was journeying there, I buried her, baderech. I buried her on the way. So we have that question of why. Why didn't Yaakov just take Rachel with him and wait for her to be buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah? Why does she need to be buried outside? And this is something that when we happen to live very close to Me'arat HaMachpelah, which is a very big zchut. We live on the road in Karmitzor on the way towards Hebron. And when we go to Me'arat HaMachpelah, it's a very spiritual experience, especially on Shabbat Chayei to read the story of when it was purchased by Avram Avinu. Rachel's absence is felt. Her absence from Me'arat HaMachpelah is felt, especially as the wife that was the beloved wife of Yaakov. So, of course, the Midrash is going to ask, and the Mefarshim, and everyone's going to jump up and raise their hand and ask the question, why didn't he just bring her to Me'arat HaMachpelah? And in terms of where she's buried now, it's not that far from Me'arat HaMachpelah. Okay? Near Beit Lechem. It's not so far. So the Breshit Rabbah explains that the reason why it says Vatamat Rachel, that he buries her there, Yaakov buries her because Yaakov foresaw Shagaliyot Atidot Lavor Sham, that the exiles in the future are going to pass by there. Okay, and without going into the historical and academic and all of those approaches of which exact exile passed by there, and that's a whole other question. If you want an article about it, I would be happy to give you an article about it, which speaks about the archaeological, the historical evidence. Without going into that, we're going to just focus on the words of the Midrash, that he saw that in the future, the exiles are going to pass by there. And so therefore he buried her there. Why? So that she can ask for compassion, for mercy from Hashem. As it says in Yirmiyahu, Kol berama nishma, here we hear the crying, our pasuk of Rahel Imeinu, who's crying over her sons. What is unique about Rahel Imeinu? Why? Again, why does he think that she should be the one that's asking for compassion? What did she do? What stands out about her? What is so unique about her? Echa Rabbah, the Midrash, which also we see also in a shorter version, we see in the Gemara as well, explain this dialogue. Fascinating dialogue that goes on between Rachel Imeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And these dialogues are always very fascinating. You can learn a lot about the character. And so it says here, B'ota Sha'ah, in that moment when they're discussing, right, where they're trying to tell Hashem, please stop this destruction, stop what's going on. Kaftzar Rachel Imeinu lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. She jumps up before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and she says, Master of the world, you know that Yaakov, your servant, loved me. He loved me with this great love. And the story of Yaakov and Rachel is that sweeping, great, one of the greatest love stories in the Tanakh, right? And we know he worked for me, for my father, for 7 years. And when those 7 years were finished, and it was time for me to marry my husband who I was waiting for, I realized, I saw that my father wanted to switch me with my sister Leah. And this was very difficult for me, right? This is very difficult for me because I knew what his plans were. So what did I do? I went, v'hodati levali, I told my husband, and I gave him a special sign that will be signed just between Yaakov and I, so that he will know, to be able to distinguish between me and my sister, so that our father wouldn't be successful in switching our places, in confusing our identities. But after, I went back on this. And what did I do? I overcame my desire to marry Yaakov, the greatest love, right? The love of my life, as we would say. I had compassion over my sister that she should not be ashamed. And so therefore it came to that night, the night of the wedding, where my father switched her with me, and I gave my sister the signs that I gave to Yaakov, so that he would think that she was Rachel. And not even that, even further than that, okay? So at the wedding itself, Leah had these special signs, but even afterwards, she went underneath their bed when he was lying there with her sister. He was lying there with my sister, and he would speak with her. She was silent. And I would answer, why? So that he wouldn't recognize the voice of my sister. And that's how I caused chesed with her. Again, that theme of kol, the voice of Rachel. The voice of Rachel is also here. It's also in the room, in the most intimate place. She's coming here in her voice. She's making her voice heard to bestow kindness upon her sister. Velo kineti ba, I didn't envy her. Velo hitzitio lecharpa, and I didn't let her, go. I didn't allow her to be shamed and disgraced. Umani. And who am I that I'm just basar v'dam, I'm just man, afar ve'efer, I'm just come from the ground. I wasn't jealous of my rival, and I didn't let her be embarrassed. And you are HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Kol HaOlam. You are the great living king, the compassionate one. Why would you be jealous of the idolatry that's going on, right? Your nation, the reason why you want to destroy your nation is because they're going to other idols. she'en ba mamash, but they are empty. There's nothing to them. And you're exiled, vihigleta banai, and you exiled my children, v'nehergu b'cherev, and my children were killed. Vaso evim bam kirtzonam, you gave them into the hands of the enemies, and they did with them what they wanted. And we know what that means historically. We know what that means when the enemies do with us what they want. Miyad, immediately, nitgalgu rachamav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His compassion is stirred. His compassion is mitgalgel, right? It's mitgalgel, it's revealed from the word litgalot. Bishvilech Rachel, ani machazeret Yisrael imkoman. For you, Rachel, I'm going to return Israel to its place. As it says, Hashem ko amar, Hashem kol berama nishma. Right? Her voice is heard. Nibechi tamrurim, the bitter cry, she's crying over her children, refusing to be comforted. And Hashem says to her, hold back your tears, because there is sachar to your actions, and there is hope for the end, because your children that are being exiled right now, that you are crying over, v'shavu vanim ligvulam, they are going to return to their borders. So once again, in the story of Rahel, and this dialogue that we see between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Rahel, we see again those themes of silence, of shame, and confusion of identity that we saw in the story of Bar Kamsa and Kamsa, but here it's the reversal. Here we see Kiviyachol, we see the tikkun, okay? Rather than the hatred that we saw in the story of Bar Kamsa between men, we see the love of Rachel and Yaakov, and also the love of Rachel for her sister. She makes sure that her sister doesn't undergo any shame by allowing the confusion of identities. Right? In the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, there's the confusion of identities. Who is Kamsa and who's Bar Kamsa? The wrong guest is invited. But rather than the host being silent and making sure to not allow Bar Kamsa to be ashamed in front of everyone, he dafka shames him in public. Rachel Imeinu, she comes here litaken. This is the tikkun. She lets her stay. She goes underneath the bed. She uses her voice in order to prevent the shame and the embarrassment of her sister. And this is really the opposite of the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And through this story, she merits to be listened to, and Hashem's mercy and his compassion is revealed, and he explains there's hope here. It's not just despair. There's going to be hope. Your children are going to return. This crying of Rachel Imeinu it's engraved in our tear ducts, right? If you just go and visit Kever Rachel, I mean, it's filled with women and men that are coming and literally pouring out their hearts and crying to Hashem. And I brought in a little bit from Matan ala Perek, that Harav Menachem Porush tells the story about historically what happened when Kever Rachel, after the 6-day war, was back in our hands again, and he says that they had the merit to be able to go to Kever Rachel, and he goes with Rav Aryeh Levin, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, and Rabbi Chaim Shmulevich, and he says Rav Aryeh Levin cries out and he says, Mama Rachel, right? Mama Rachel, he calls out to her. And Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz says, in these great cries, he says, Ima Rachel, it says in the Pasuk, refrain from crying. V'ani omer lach, but I say to you, hamshichi livkot. Keep on crying. Keep those tears coming. Ki yesh tzachar lepulatech. There's reward for this. Your tears are listened to. Your tears are answered. And then he says later on, historically, when it's the Oslo Accords, and Rabin wanted to give back Kever Rachel, and many people tried to pressure him, and they came to him and they said to him, don't give this back, don't give this to the Palestinian Authority. But they with unavail, he didn't listen to them. And he explained in the beginning, I hesitated, should I go, should I not go? In the end, he decided to go. And he says to him, how can you possibly give away Kever Rachel? The decision is now in your hands. And he says, Tafasti et Rabin, I grabbed him and I started to cry. And it was impossible to stop this. And Rabin stood there and he was just shocked and silent. And he says, really? Ad kedei kacha ta nirgash? I mean, even so much, you're so emotional about this? And I said to him, Kever Rachel za neshama shelanu. This is our soul. And he explains how his tears and his cries just kept coming. Lo itzlachti la'atzor et atzmi. I wasn't able to stop myself. And in that same meeting, he was told that the decision was reversed and that Kever Rachel was not going to be given to the Palestinian Authority. The tears of Harav Menachem Porush over Rachel Imeinu, over Kever Rachel, were heeded too, were heard. And just to end off, a modern day example of, I don't know if you've heard of this, the speech of the three mothers that, this famous speech that was given this past Yom HaZikaron by the Chief of General Staff, General Aviv Kochavi. It's called the Shloshet Imahot, the Three Mothers. This speech was delivered at Kever, at the Kotel. He speaks about three mothers, and he brings in Rachel Imeinu, this woman called Nechami Israeli, and a third mother. And I'm just going to read just part of this speech. If you would like, I'm very happy to send to you the source sheet, or you can look it up in line to read the whole speech. I recommend also listening to it, because also listening to it makes it stand out. So he's speaking about the return of Israel, of the people to Israel, to our homeland, and explaining how it's an unprecedented event in history, a sort of miracle, right? Even if the present generation takes it for granted. Explains about this journey that's been going on over the world, right? And he mentions these three mothers that he'd like to speak about. The first is Rahel, for whom it was not possible to live in her own country. She experienced alienation without a sense of belonging. Rachel Imeinu lived most of her life in Haran, and when she came to Israel, she died very soon after in childbirth. She succeeded in reaching the promised land, but wasn't able to live there. And when her sons were exiled from the land and past her grave, so it is written, a cry was heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. And yet her cry was heard, and the prophet Yirmiyahu promised, keep your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears. The sons shall return to their borders. Okay, this is in a speech, just a little bit of context of a secular a secular head of the army that's bringing in these psukim from Yirmiyahu. Okay. And he goes on to explain that about most of our history takes place outside of the borders of our country, but we are the generation of the children who return to our borders. We're back this time for good. Yet the journey of return has taken a heavy toll. The second mother, Nechama, was also a person of action. She left her home in Ukraine, and together with her husband Joseph, who fled Nazi Austria, she immigrated to Israel to start a family and build a country. They changed their last name to Israeli, and settled in Kibbutz Dovrat, filling their home with the values of Zionism. A nation that rises from the dead needs children, Nechama said, and had 5 of her own. Her 2 boys, Effie and Dedi, were the very best of friends. Effie became an officer and instructor in the Armored Corps officers course, and Dedi followed in his footsteps. But then all this course was never completed because the Yom Kippur War came about. Both of them were sent to battle. And Dedi's tank was hit by a missile, and even though he had severe burns, he returned to rescue a member of his team, and then he was evacuated. But his brother Effie remained, and later on, unfortunately, his brother was hit again, a second time, and he was killed. The knock on the Israeli family's door, the ominous knock, became sadly a part of the nation's story. It became a part of the nation's pulse. And again, with Hebrew, Tfika is a knock, and dofek is a pulse. So that's also just a beautiful play on words. Too many families have heard that knock, followed by a shrieking pain, too great to be contained. Okay, and he goes on in the speech, and he speaks about the purpose of the army and how it's there and to protect and how they work on it. And he goes back to the story of the second mother, and he explains that despite the heavy burns that Effie's brother Dedi suffered, his situation began to improve. He lay in a secluded hospital room, not knowing the truth about his brother. He had trouble speaking. However, after a few days, when his father Yosef entered his room, Dedi raised his hand and said, "Dad, I managed to write Effie a letter." Yosef, the grieving father, was stunned. He kept still for a moment and then said to his son, "There is no one to receive the letter. Ephraim is gone." Dedi's heart sank when he heard the news. He stopped fighting for his own life and withered away until he succumbed to his pain and died. 2 mothers mourn their son's fate. One, This is referring to Rahel Imeinu. One had no country, yet her children returned from enemy lands. Right? V'shavu banim ligvulam, we returned to our borders, while the other lived in her own country at the cost of the lives of her 2 sons. This is Nechama. There is no greater price than this, and I, with all humbleness, would not dare say, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears. But I find hope in the words of Yirmiyahu, saying, there is a reward for your labor. Indeed, there is, and the third mother benefits from it. I do not know her name, but she represents many mothers, including me, Baruch Hashem, who inhabit this nation. They have raised families and their children fulfill themselves and continue to build the state of Israel. They are secular and religious mothers from villages and cities, Jewish, Druze, Christian, and Muslim. They have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they all live in their country safely and securely. And he ends off speaking about the resolve and the strength, and he says, this is the same strength that Rahel did in the words of Nechama only days after Dedi passed away. If there are no values to dedicate life to, life itself has no value. It's a very powerful sentence. Thus she spoke, may the memory of our fallen boys and girls be a blessing. From the story of Rahel Imeinu, the tears of Rahel Imeinu, I think that when Tisha B'Av comes and we're sitting on the floor and we're crying, we can only hope that our tears as mothers and as sisters and daughters and friends, that our tears can join the tears of Rahel Imeinu, and that we can knock on the gates of heaven and say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, open the gates, listen to our tears, the same way that you listened to the tears of Rahel Imeinu. Let us walk in the footsteps of Rahel Imeinu that did everything for the love of her sister, so that she could prevent her sister from undergoing any sort of shame, because shaming someone is like killing them. Let us follow in those footsteps of having that kindness, that mesirut nefesh, that ability to sacrifice in any way possible, right? Every person has their own way of finding their own mesirut nefesh for Am Yisrael, for our families. And Be'ezrat Hashem, may there be tikva lachiratech, let there be tikva, v'shavu banim ligvulam, and allow us to all return to the borders of Israel, to Yerushalayim, to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash b'mhera v'yameinu this Tisha B'Av.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.